She had always been the kind of person people overlooked without even realizing it. In a crowded room, she was the one sitting quietly in the corner, observing more than speaking. Her clothes were simple, often worn a little longer than they should have been, not because she didn't care, but because there were more important things in life than appearances. Most people who met her for the first time assumed she was shy, maybe even unsure of herself. But the truth was, she carried a world inside her that very few ever got to see. She grew up in a small, quiet neighborhood where life moved slowly. The houses were close together, the streets were narrow, and everyone seemed to know each other. It wasn't a place of luxury, but it was full of stories. Stories of hard work, struggle, and small moments of happiness. Her family was like many others around them. They worked hard every day just to keep things going. There was never much extra, but there was always enough to get by. From a young age, she learned how to be content with little. While other children dreamed about expensive toys or big adventures, she found joy in simple things. A quiet afternoon, the sound of rain tapping on the roof, or the feeling of sitting alone with her thoughts. These were the moments she cherished. But there was one thing that meant more to her than anything else. It was the piano. The first time she saw it, it wasn't in her home. It stood quietly in a small community center not far from where she lived. The building itself was old, with faded paint and creaky doors, but inside it held something special. The piano sat against the wall, slightly out of tune, with a few keys that didn't respond the way they should. Most people barely noticed it. To them, it was just another piece of furniture, something that had been there for years and would probably stay there forever. But to her, it was different. She remembered standing in front of it for the first time, unsure if she was even allowed to touch it. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant and curious at the same time. When she finally pressed one, the sound that came out was soft, slightly imperfect, but to her it felt magical. It was as if something inside her had been waiting for that moment all along. After that day, she kept coming back. At first, she would only play when no one else was around. She didn't want anyone to hear her mistakes or see her struggle to figure things out. She would sit there quietly, pressing one key at a time, listening carefully, trying to understand how the sounds connected. There were no lessons, no teacher guiding her, no sheet music to follow. Everything she learned came from listening, from feeling, and from trying again and again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Slowly, the sounds she created began to change. What started as random notes began to form simple melodies. She didn't even realize it at first. She was just playing what felt right, letting her fingers move naturally across the keys. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine stories in her mind, and somehow those stories would turn into music. Even then, no one really noticed. People would pass by the room, hear faint sounds coming from inside, and continue on with their day. Some might pause for a second, but they never stayed long enough to truly listen. It didn't bother her. In fact, she preferred it that way. The piano became her space, a place where she didn't have to explain herself or meet anyone's expectations. At home, life continued as usual. There were responsibilities to take care of, chores to be done, and moments when things felt difficult. There were times when she wondered if she should focus on something more practical, something that could help her family more directly. Music, after all, didn't seem like a reliable path. It was just something she loved, something that made her feel alive. But every time she tried to step away from it, she found herself drawn back. There was something about the piano that gave her a sense of peace she couldn't find anywhere else. When she played, the noise of the world seemed to fade away. The worries, the doubts, the quiet pressure of everyday life, they all became distant. In their place, there was only the sound of the music and the feeling of being completely present in the moment. One evening, as the sun was setting and the community center was nearly empty, she sat down at the piano as usual. The light from the window cast a soft glow across the room, and everything felt calm. She began to play a simple tune she had heard somewhere before. It wasn't anything complicated, just a basic melody that most beginners could learn quickly. But as she played, something unexpected happened. She didn't stop at the melody. Without thinking, she began to add her own touches. A slight pause here, a softer note there, a small variation that changed the feeling of the song. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. But then it grew. The simple tune began to take on a new shape, something deeper and more emotional. It was no longer just a song. It was an expression of everything she felt but couldn't put into words. She didn't realize it, but someone had stopped outside the room. An older woman who worked at the center had been walking by when she heard the music. At first, she thought it was just someone practicing. But something about the way the notes flowed made her pause. She stood there quietly, listening, not wanting to interrupt. When the music ended, the room fell silent again. The girl opened her eyes, unaware that anyone had been listening. She let out a small breath and looked down at her hands, as if trying to understand what had just happened herself. The woman stepped inside slowly. "That was beautiful," she said gently. The girl looked up, surprised and a little embarrassed. She wasn't used to being noticed, especially not for something like this. She didn't know what to say, so she simply gave a small nod. "Have you ever thought about performing?" the woman asked. The question caught her off guard. Performing was something she had never seriously considered. It felt like a world far away from her own, a place where people were confident, trained, and sure of themselves. She didn't see herself as any of those things. "I just play for myself," she replied quietly. The woman smiled, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. Sometimes, the world needs to hear things we think are only for ourselves. Those words stayed with her long after that evening. Over the next few days, she found herself thinking about them more than she expected. The idea of performing felt both exciting and terrifying. What if she wasn't good enough? What if people didn't understand her music the way she did? What if she made mistakes? But there was another thought that kept coming back. What if she never tried? A week later, a small poster appeared on the notice board at the community center. It announced a local piano competition. It wasn't anything grand or famous, just a small event where people from nearby areas could come and perform. Still, it was something. She stood in front of the poster for a long time, reading it over and over again. Her heart beat a little faster. This was an opportunity, but it was also a risk. She imagined herself on a stage, sitting in front of strangers, all eyes on her. The thought made her nervous. She had spent so much time playing alone, in quiet rooms where no one judged her. Stepping into a space where people would listen, evaluate, and form opinions felt overwhelming. And yet, she couldn't walk away. For the first time, she began to wonder what it would be like to share her music with others. Not just to play for herself, but to let people hear the stories she had been carrying inside her all this time. She reached out slowly and touched the edge of the poster, as if making the decision real. Maybe she didn't fit the image of a performer. Maybe she didn't have formal training or polished skills. But she had something real. And deep down, she knew that might be enough. The decision to sign up for the competition did not feel real at first. Even after she wrote her name on the simple registration form, she kept wondering if she had made a mistake. Her handwriting looked small and unsure compared to the bold, confident names already on the list. For a moment, she thought about crossing it out and quietly walking away, pretending she had never been there. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped back, took a deep breath, and looked at her name again. It was there now, and there was no turning back. A strange mix of fear and excitement settled inside her chest. She didn't tell many people about it. In fact, she told almost no one. It felt too personal, too uncertain to share. In the days that followed, her routine stayed mostly the same, but something inside her had changed. When she sat at the piano, it no longer felt like a completely private space. Now there was a purpose behind every note she played. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was preparing. At first, she didn't know what piece she should choose. The competition allowed participants to perform any song they wanted. Some would likely choose complex, well-known compositions to impress the judges. She knew that. She had seen videos before, watched people play fast, powerful pieces that left audiences amazed. But that wasn't her style. She found herself returning to simple melodies again and again. Songs that were easy to understand, easy to follow, but full of emotion if played the right way. She believed that even the simplest song could become something special if it was played with feeling. Still, doubt followed her closely. Late at night, when everything was quiet, those thoughts became louder. What if the judges didn't care about feeling? What if they only looked for technical skill? What if she walked onto that stage and froze? The idea of failing in front of others made her uneasy. There were moments when she almost convinced herself to quit. One evening, she sat in front of the piano but didn't play a single note. Her hands rested in her lap as she stared at the keys. For the first time in a long while, the piano didn't feel comforting. It felt like a question she didn't know how to answer. "Maybe I'm not ready," she whispered to herself. The words hung in the air, heavy and real. But then she remembered something. She remembered the first time she touched the piano. There had been no expectations then, no pressure to be good or perfect. She had played simply because she loved it. Somewhere along the way, that simple feeling had been replaced by fear. Slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them back on the keys. She started with a single note, then another. The sound filled the room again, soft and familiar. It didn't matter if it was perfect. It didn't matter if anyone else would understand. In that moment, she realized something important. Her music didn't need to compete with anyone else's. It only needed to be honest. From that day on, her practice changed. She stopped trying to play like others. She stopped worrying about how impressive her performance would look. Instead, she focused on how it felt. Each note became a way to express something she couldn't say out loud. Some days, the music felt light and hopeful. Other days, it carried a quiet sadness. But it was always real. As the competition day got closer, the community center became busier. More participants started coming in to practice. For the first time, she wasn't alone in that space. She noticed them right away. Some played confidently, their fingers moving quickly across the keys with practiced ease. Others came with sheets of music, carefully following every note. There were even a few who had teachers sitting beside them, giving instructions and corrections. She stayed quiet, observing as she always did. But this time, she could feel the difference between them and herself more clearly. They looked prepared, experienced, sure of what they were doing. She, on the other hand, still felt like she was figuring things out as she went. One afternoon, as she was practicing, a small group gathered nearby. They weren't being unkind, but their presence made her nervous. She could feel their attention, even when they weren't directly looking at her. "She's new, right?" one of them whispered. "I think so," another replied. "Probably just starting." Their words weren't harsh, but they still stung a little. She kept playing, pretending not to hear. After a few minutes, she stopped and quietly stepped away from the piano. Her hands felt colder than usual. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, but now it felt different. Now there was something at stake. That evening, she went home earlier than usual. She sat by herself, replaying the moment in her mind. The whispers, the looks, the quiet assumptions. They all stayed with her. A part of her wanted to prove them wrong, but another part wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe she was just a beginner. Maybe she didn't belong there. The thoughts kept circling in her mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. The next day, she almost didn't go back to the community center. She stood outside for a long time, looking at the door. It would have been easy to turn around and walk away. No one would have questioned her. No one would have expected anything from her. But then she thought about how far she had already come. She thought about all the quiet hours she had spent learning on her own. All the moments when she had chosen to keep going, even when no one was watching. Walking away now would mean letting all of that go. So she opened the door and stepped inside. This time something felt different. She wasn't there to compare herself to others. She wasn't there to meet anyone's expectations. She was there for the same reason she had always been, to play. When she sat down at the piano, she didn't look around to see who was watching. She didn't think about the competition or the judges. She simply began. The music came out naturally, as if it had been waiting for her to return. People noticed, not all at once and not in an obvious way, but slowly, one by one, a few heads turned. The room grew a little quieter. The same people who had whispered before now listened without speaking. There was something different about the way she played. It wasn't loud or flashy. It wasn't filled with fast, complicated movements. But it had a depth that was hard to ignore. Felt honest, like a story being told without words. When she finished, she didn't wait for any reaction. She simply stood up and walked away, just as she always did. But this time, the silence behind her felt different. It wasn't empty. It was thoughtful. As the final days before the competition passed, her nervousness didn't disappear, but it changed. It became something she could manage, something that reminded her that what she was about to do mattered. She still didn't know how the judges would see her. She still didn't know what the outcome would be. But she knew one thing for certain. She would walk onto that stage and play in her own way. Not louder, not faster, just real. And somewhere deep inside, she began to feel ready. The morning of the competition arrived more quickly than she expected. It felt like only a few days ago she had been standing in front of that notice board, unsure if she should even sign her name. Now there was no more time to think or prepare. The day she had been quietly building toward was finally here. She woke up earlier than usual. For a few moments, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of the morning outside. Everything felt normal, almost too normal, as if the day had forgotten how important it was supposed to be. But then the memory returned all at once, and her heart began to beat faster. Today, she would perform in front of others for the first time. She sat up slowly, taking a deep breath. Her hands felt slightly cold, even though the room wasn't. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it. A mix of nerves, excitement, and uncertainty all at once. She got ready quietly, choosing the same simple clothes she always wore. She didn't spend time trying to look different or stand out. That wasn't who she was. If anything, she wanted to feel as much like herself as possible. Before leaving, she paused for a moment, standing near the door. She looked down at her hands, gently moving her fingers as if warming them up. These hands had spent countless hours learning, practicing, making mistakes, and starting again. Now they would have to carry her through something completely new. The journey to the competition venue felt longer than usual. Every step seemed to come with a thought. What if she forgot the notes? What if her hands froze? What if the judges didn't understand her style? The questions came one after another, making it hard to stay calm. But then she remembered something simple. She didn't need to be perfect. She only needed to play. When she finally arrived, the building was already filled with people. The entrance was busy, with participants, families, and organizers moving in and out. There was a quiet energy in the air, a mix of excitement and tension that everyone seemed to share. She stepped inside, trying not to draw attention to herself. The room where participants gathered was larger than she expected. Chairs were arranged in rows, and a few pianos were placed around for last-minute practice. Some people were already there, going over their pieces again and again. Others sat quietly, eyes closed, focusing on their breathing. She found a seat near the back. From there, she could observe without feeling too exposed. She watched as others prepared, noticing the confidence in some and the nervousness in others. It was comforting, in a way, to realize she wasn't the only one feeling this. A few participants stood out. One played with great speed, their fingers moving so fast it was hard to follow. Another practiced the same difficult section over and over, determined to get it right. There were even a few who seemed completely relaxed, chatting and smiling as if this were just another ordinary day. She wondered what it would feel like to have that kind of confidence. Her name was on a list near the front of the room, along with the order of performances. She walked over slowly and scanned the list until she found it. She wasn't first. She wasn't last either. Her turn was somewhere in the middle. For a moment, she felt relief. At least she would have some time to watch and understand how things worked. But at the same time, the waiting would make it harder. The longer she sat there, the more time her thoughts would have to grow. She returned to her seat and placed her hands together in her lap. Minutes passed slowly. One by one, participants were called to perform. Each time a name was announced, the room would grow quiet for a moment before the person stood up and walked toward the stage. From where she sat, she couldn't see the stage clearly, but she could hear everything. The first performance began. The music was strong and confident, filled with fast notes and clear precision. When it ended, there was polite applause. It sounded impressive, the kind of performance she thought the judges would like. More participants followed. Each one brought something different. Some played complex pieces that required great skill. Others made small mistakes but continued without stopping. A few performances stood out, drawing louder applause and quiet murmurs of approval. As she listened, her nervousness slowly returned. Her piece was simple. Compared to what she was hearing, it almost felt too simple. Would the judges think she hadn't tried hard enough? Would they assume she lacked skill? The thought made her chest feel tight. She closed her eyes for a moment. This wasn't about them. It had never been about them. She reminded herself why she had come here in the first place. Not to compete in the traditional sense, not to prove she was better than anyone else, but to share something real. Still, it wasn't easy to hold on to that feeling. As the performances continued, she became more aware of the small details around her. The quiet tapping of a foot, the soft rustle of papers, the occasional whisper between audience members. Every sound seemed louder than usual. Then, she heard something that made her pause. Two judges speaking quietly to each other. "Let's see if we get something simple next," one of them said, almost casually. "After all these advanced pieces, that would be a change," the other replied. Their words weren't directed at her, but they still stayed in her mind. Simple. The word echoed in her thoughts. She looked down at her hands again. Was simple a bad thing? For a moment, doubt returned stronger than before. But then she remembered the way she felt when she played. The way a simple melody could become something meaningful if it was played with care and emotion. That feeling had never been wrong. She held onto it tightly. Time continued to pass. The list grew shorter. And then, finally, she heard it. Her name. Felt like everything slowed down at once. For a brief second, she didn't move. The sound of her name echoed in her ears, mixing with the sudden silence in the room. This was the moment she had been thinking about for days. And now that it was here, it didn't feel real. She stood up. Her legs felt steady, even though her heart was racing. She took a deep breath and began walking toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last. She could feel the presence of the audience now, even without looking directly at them. The judges sat at the front, their attention focused on the stage. She wondered what they were expecting, what kind of performance they were hoping to see. When she reached the piano, she paused. The instrument looked different under the bright lights. It was polished, well-maintained, nothing like the old piano she was used to. For a moment, it felt unfamiliar. She sat down slowly. Her hands rested just above the keys. The room was completely silent. She could feel every heartbeat, every breath, every small movement inside her. This was the point where everything could go wrong. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the entire performance could fall apart. But then something changed. She stopped thinking about the audience. She stopped thinking about the judges. She stopped thinking about the outcome. All that remained was the piano in front of her. She placed her fingers on the keys. The first note hadn't been played yet, but already, the noise in her mind had begun to fade. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. It was just a part of the moment, nothing more. She took one final breath. And in that quiet space, just before the music began, she felt something unexpected. Not fear, not doubt, but a quiet kind of readiness. The kind that doesn't come from being perfect, but from being true to yourself. Her fingers pressed down gently, and the moment began. The first note was soft, almost gentle, as if it didn't want to disturb the silence too quickly. It lingered in the air for a moment, clear but simple, exactly what everyone expected. A few people in the audience adjusted in their seats, preparing themselves for what they assumed would be an easy, forgettable performance. Her fingers moved slowly across the keys, playing the melody just as it was written. There was nothing complicated about it. No fast runs, No dramatic movements, no sudden changes. It was calm, steady, and familiar, the kind of tune many beginners learn early on. At the judges' table, one of them made a small note on a piece of paper. Another leaned back slightly, watching without much expression. To them, it seemed like exactly what they had predicted. A simple song, played in a simple way. But she didn't rush. She let each note breathe. There was a quiet patience in the way she played, as if she wasn't trying to get through the piece but rather stay inside it. Her eyes remained gently focused on the keys, her posture relaxed, her movements natural. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was listening. A few seconds passed, then something began to shift. It was subtle at first. A slight pause between notes, just a fraction longer than expected. A softer touch on one key, followed by a slightly stronger one. Small changes that most people wouldn't notice right away, but enough to create a different feeling. The melody was still the same, but the way it was being told had changed. One of the judges leaned forward just a little. The room, which had been quietly indifferent, began to grow more attentive. It wasn't because the music had become louder or faster. It was because something about it felt real. She continued, her fingers moving with more confidence now. The simple tune slowly began to unfold in a new way. She added gentle variations, letting certain notes stretch longer, giving others a softer touch. It was like she was speaking through the piano, shaping each phrase with care. The audience started to notice. A woman in the second row tilted her head slightly, as if trying to understand what she was hearing. Someone near the back stopped looking at their phone and looked up instead. Even the quiet whispers in the room faded away. The music was still simple, but it no longer felt ordinary. There was emotion in it now. Not loud or overwhelming, but deep and steady. Felt like a story being told slowly, one note at a time. A story of quiet moments, of hidden feelings, of things that don't need words to be understood. Her hands moved more freely now. She wasn't thinking about the next note or worrying about mistakes. She was simply following the feeling, letting the music guide her. The piece that had started as something basic was now becoming something personal. At the judges' table, the atmosphere had changed completely. The same judge who had been writing earlier had stopped. His pen rested still on the paper as he watched more closely. Another judge sat upright, their eyes fixed on her hands. There was no longer any sign of boredom or distraction. They were listening, truly listening. The melody grew slightly richer. She added layers, not in a way that made it complex, but in a way that made it meaningful. The simple structure of the song remained, but the depth of expression gave it a new life. It felt like she was taking something small and revealing everything it could be. The room was completely silent now. Not the kind of silence that comes from disinterest, but the kind that comes from focus. No one wanted to break it. No one wanted to miss even a single note. She could feel it. Even with her eyes on the keys, she could sense the shift in the room. The attention, the stillness, the quiet connection forming between her and the audience. But instead of making her nervous, it gave her strength. For the first time, she wasn't just playing alone. She was sharing something. Her fingers moved with more confidence, her touch becoming more expressive. There were moments when the music softened, almost like a whisper, and moments when it grew slightly stronger, carrying a quiet intensity. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful in its own way. One of the judges exchanged a glance with another. It was a look of surprise. Not because the piece was difficult, but because of how it was being played. They had expected a basic performance, something easy to evaluate and move past. Instead, they were witnessing something they hadn't prepared for. A simple song, played in a way that felt unforgettable. As the piece moved toward its middle, she allowed herself to explore even more. She added small touches that reflected her own style, her own understanding of the music. It wasn't written in any book or taught by any teacher. It came from her experience, her quiet hours of practice, her connection with the piano. Every note felt intentional. Every pause had meaning. And slowly, the audience began to feel it too. Someone in the front row leaned forward, their eyes focused and still. Another person gently placed their hand over their chest, as if the music had reached something personal inside them. This wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a moment. The kind of moment that doesn't happen often. The kind that can't be planned or repeated exactly the same way. She continued without hesitation. The final section of the piece approached, and there was a soft sense of anticipation in the air. Even those who didn't understand music deeply could feel that something was building. Her hands slowed slightly. The melody returned to its simplest form, almost like it had come full circle. But now it carried everything that had happened before. Every emotion, every variation, every quiet expression was woven into those final notes. The room held its breath. She played the last few notes gently, letting them fade naturally into silence. And then it was over. Her hands remained on the keys for a brief moment, as if she didn't want to leave the music just yet. Then slowly, she lifted them. The silence that followed was deep. For a second, no one moved. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are still processing what they've just experienced. No one wanted to rush it, to break it too quickly. She looked down, unsure of what to expect. Had they understood? Had it been enough? Her heart beat softly in her chest as she waited. And then, somewhere in the room, a single clap, followed by another, then another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. Not polite, not forced, but genuine. Strong. Real. She looked up, surprised. People were no longer just watching her, they were reacting. Some were smiling, others nodding, a few even standing as they clapped. The energy in the room had completely changed. At the judges' table, their expressions said everything. There was no trace of the earlier assumptions. Only respect. One of them gave a small, approving nod. Another leaned back slightly, as if still taking in what had just happened. The notes they had written before no longer seemed important, because this performance hadn't followed expectations. It had changed them. She stood up slowly from the piano. The applause continued as she stepped away, her movements calm but her heart full. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she could feel it. Something had shifted, not just in the room but inside her as well. For the first time, she realized that her way of playing, her simple, honest, quiet way, was enough. More than enough. And as she walked off the stage, the sound of the applause stayed with her, not as noise, but as a reminder that even the simplest song, when played with truth, can leave a lasting mark. The applause did not stop as quickly as she expected. It continued, strong and steady, filling the room in a way she had never experienced before. She stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do, her hands resting gently by her sides. This kind of reaction felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. She had played the piano many times before, but always in quiet spaces, always alone or unnoticed. No one had ever clapped like this for her. No one had ever looked at her the way these people were looking at her now. She gave a small, polite nod, then turned and walked off the stage. Each step felt light, as if she was floating rather than walking. Her heart was still beating fast, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was something else. Something warm and overwhelming, something she didn't quite have words for. As she returned to the waiting area, the atmosphere around her felt different. People who hadn't paid attention to her before were now looking at her openly. Some smiled as she passed. Others whispered quietly, but this time, their tone had changed. There was no doubt in their voices now, only curiosity and respect. She sat down in the same seat she had chosen earlier, trying to calm herself. Her hands were still slightly shaking, but not in the same way as before. It wasn't nervousness anymore. It was the after effect of something intense, something meaningful. She placed her hands together and looked down, letting the moment settle inside her. A few minutes passed before someone approached her. It was one of the participants she had seen earlier, someone who had been practicing a fast and difficult piece. He stood near her for a moment, as if unsure how to begin. "That was really good," he said finally. His voice was honest, without any hint of competition or comparison. She looked up, a little surprised, and gave a small smile. "Thank you. I didn't expect that," he added, not in a negative way but as a simple truth. You made it sound different. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded softly. After he left, another person came over, then another. Some only said a few words, while others tried to explain what they had felt during her performance. Each comment was different, but they all carried the same message. They had been moved. She listened quietly, not interrupting, not trying to explain herself. For so long, her music had been something personal, something she kept to herself. Now, hearing others talk about it felt both strange and meaningful. It made her realize that what she felt while playing wasn't just her own experience, could reach others too. Across the room, the judges were speaking with each other. Their conversation was quiet, but their expressions were serious. They occasionally glanced in her direction, as if still thinking about what they had just witnessed. Papers were shuffled, notes were reviewed, but it was clear that something about her performance had stayed with them. The competition continued. There were still a few participants left to perform, and one by one they were called to the stage. She listened, just as she had before, but now everything felt slightly different. She wasn't comparing herself anymore. She wasn't questioning her place there. She had already given everything she had. Now all she could do was wait. Time moved slowly again, but not in the same uncomfortable way as before. There was a quiet calm inside her now, a sense of acceptance. Whatever happened next, she knew she had been true to herself. Finally, the last performance ended. The room grew quiet as the judges prepared to make their decision. There was a short break, giving them time to review their notes and discuss the results. During that time, the participants waited together, each lost in their own thoughts. Some looked confident, others looked nervous. She sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze soft and steady. She wasn't trying to predict the outcome. She wasn't imagining herself winning or losing. She was simply present. After some time, the judges returned. The room became still. Everyone took their seats, their attention focused on the front. The air felt heavier now, filled with anticipation. This was the moment that would bring everything to a close. One of the judges stood up. He began by thanking everyone for their participation, speaking about the effort, the dedication, and the love for music that had been shown that day. His words were thoughtful but brief. Everyone knew what they were really waiting for. Then the announcements began. Third place. A name was called, followed by applause. The person stood up, smiling with a mix of relief and pride, and walked to the front to receive their recognition. Second place. Another name. More applause. She listened quietly, her expression unchanged. Her heart remained steady. With each announcement, the number of possibilities became smaller, but she didn't let herself get carried away by hope or doubt. And then there was a pause, a slightly longer one. The judge looked down at the paper in his hands, then back up at the audience. For the first place, he said slowly, we chose a performance that reminded us of something important. The room grew even quieter. A performance that showed us that music is not only about complexity or speed, but about feeling, honesty, and connection. Her breath caught slightly. She didn't move. The winner is, he said her name. For a second, she didn't react. It felt like the sound had reached her ears but hadn't fully settled in her mind. The room around her seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet stillness. Then the applause began again, stronger than before. People turned to look at her, some smiling, some nodding, some clapping with genuine excitement. The person sitting next to her gently touched her arm, as if to bring her back to the moment. You should go, they said softly. She stood up. Her legs felt steady, but everything else felt light, almost distant. She walked toward the stage slowly, each step bringing the moment closer to reality. When she reached the front, the judge smiled at her. Well done, he said, handing her the award. She accepted it with both hands, her fingers wrapping around it carefully, as if it might disappear if she wasn't gentle enough. Thank you, she replied quietly. There were no long speeches, no dramatic reactions. Just a simple exchange, a quiet recognition of what had happened. But inside her, something was changing. As she turned to face the audience, she saw the same room, the same people, but everything felt different. Not because she had won, but because of what that moment represented. For so long, she had been invisible. For so long, she had doubted whether her way of playing mattered. And now, without trying to be anything other than herself, she had been seen. The applause continued as she stepped down from the stage. When she returned to her seat, the feeling was no longer overwhelming. It was calm, steady, real. People around her smiled. Some congratulated her again. But she didn't feel the need to say much. She simply held onto the moment. Not as a victory over others, but as a quiet confirmation that what she had been doing all along, playing with honesty, with feeling, with simplicity, was enough to reach people. And maybe, just maybe, that was more valuable than anything else. The days after the competition did not feel as loud or dramatic as she once imagined they would be. There were no sudden changes in her daily life, no big celebrations waiting for her, no crowds following her around. In many ways, everything looked the same from the outside. But inside, something had shifted quietly. She woke up the next morning just like always, with the same soft light coming through the window and the same familiar sounds around her. For a moment, she wondered if the competition had just been a dream, felt distant, like something that had happened far away. Then she saw the small award placed carefully on the table. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was real. She walked over and picked it up, holding it in her hands. There was no sudden rush of excitement this time, no overwhelming emotion. Instead, there was a calm understanding settling inside her. She had done something she once thought was impossible. Not because she had tried to be better than others, but because she had stayed true to herself. That thought stayed with her as she went about her day. When she returned to the community center later that afternoon, the place felt both familiar and new at the same time. The same old walls, the same quiet rooms, the same slightly worn piano. It was all still there. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything felt different. As she stepped inside, a few people noticed her right away. There were small smiles, quiet nods, and gentle greetings. Nothing overwhelming, nothing uncomfortable, just simple acknowledgement. The kind that made her feel seen but not pressured. She walked toward the piano room slowly. For a moment, she paused at the door, just like she had done the very first time she saw the instrument. Back then, she had been unsure if she even belonged there. Now that feeling was gone. She stepped inside and sat down. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a second, then rested gently on them. She didn't rush to play. She simply sat there, taking in the quiet, letting the moment settle. Then softly she began. The music that came out was not very different from before. It was still simple, still calm, still honest. But there was a new kind of confidence in it now. Not loud or proud, but steady and certain. She no longer questioned whether her way of playing was enough. She knew it was. As she played, someone stopped at the door. It was a young girl, much younger than her, standing quietly and watching. She didn't say anything at first, just listened with wide eyes. When the music ended, she stepped a little closer. "Can you show me how to play like that?" she asked softly. The question was simple, but it meant more than she expected. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had never thought of herself as someone who could teach or guide others. She had learned everything on her own, slowly and quietly. But now, someone was looking at her the same way she once looked at the piano, with curiosity and hope. She smiled gently. "I can try," she replied. That small moment became the beginning of something new. In the days that followed, she found herself spending more time at the community center. Not just playing, but sharing. The young girl returned, and sometimes others came too. They didn't come for perfect lessons or strict rules. They came to learn how to feel the music, how to understand it in their own way. And she taught them the only way she knew how. With patience, with simplicity, with honesty. She didn't correct every mistake. She didn't focus on making everything perfect. Instead, she encouraged them to listen, to explore, to find their own connection with the piano. Slowly, the room that once felt quiet and empty began to fill with soft sounds of learning. Simple notes, small melodies, moments of discovery. And in those moments, she saw something that reminded her of her own journey. The same hesitation, the same curiosity, the same quiet joy when a note finally sounded just right. Outside the community center, her story began to spread. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but through simple conversations. Someone who had attended the competition told a friend. That friend told someone else. People spoke about the performance, about how a simple song had turned into something unforgettable. A few weeks later, she received a small invitation. Another local event. Another opportunity to play. This time, the feeling was different. She still felt nervous, but it wasn't the same kind of fear. It was lighter, easier to manage. She understood now that the outcome wasn't the most important part. What mattered was the moment, the connection, the honesty in the music. She accepted the invitation, not because she wanted to prove anything, but because she wanted to continue sharing. As time passed, more opportunities came. Small stages, simple gatherings. Nothing too big, nothing overwhelming. But each time she played, she carried the same approach with her. She didn't try to change her style to match expectations. She didn't try to become louder or more complex just to impress. She remained herself. And that, more than anything, became her strength. People began to recognize her not for how fast she played or how difficult her pieces were, but for how her music made them feel. There was something genuine in it, something that stayed with them even after the sound had faded. And through all of this, she never forgot where she started. The quiet room, the old piano, the moments when no one was watching. She returned to those memories often, not with sadness, but with gratitude. They had shaped her, taught her, guided her in a way no formal training ever could. One evening, as she sat alone at the piano once again, she thought about everything that had happened. The doubts, the whispers, the fear, the stage, the applause, the silence before the first note. All of it felt like part of a larger story now. A story that wasn't about winning or losing, but about discovering something true. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The melody was simple, just like the one she had played at the competition. But this time it carried even more meaning. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She understood now that greatness doesn't always come from complexity or perfection. Sometimes it comes from the ability to stay honest, to stay real, even when the world expects something else. And as the music filled the room, soft and steady, it felt like a quiet reminder that even the simplest song, when played with heart, can change everything. Not just for others, but for the one who dares to play it.